Good evening, everybody. God bless you and grace and peace to you. This is Bishop J. Charles Carrington Jr., and I am delighted and elated to be here. Excuse me, kind of looking casual. I know the ladies and the presenters on this wonderful venue are looking fabulous as ever. Benita is smiling, Tiara is smiling, Lauren is smiling, everybody is smiling. I am Bishop J. Charles Carrington Jr., Senior Pastor of Life Builders Church, and we welcome you to the collaboration of Life Builders Church and our wonderful, wonderful, talented, and anointed and very capable hosts, Keys of Hope Consultants. That is Miss Tiara Sidnor and Miss Lauren Capel. We are so thankful for what they've done. Last week was a tremendous start, And I am so thankful that we are here this evening to go to another level. I know that as a pastor, we have been in postures to see death and loss, and not just death, but just loss of various kinds, trauma. And I can witness that as a pastor, we suffer PTSD, whether we want to admit it or not. And key leaders see things that a lot of people don't usually see. And if we say it doesn't affect us, we're lying. If lay people say it doesn't affect it or them, they're lying. I'm so thankful that Keys of Hope Consultants have put together a team of people that's going to speak directly to the needs that we have. And I want everybody on this venue this evening to take full advantage of what you're going to hear, what you're going to see, take full advantage of the speakers, and just receive. I know there'll be time for questions and time for answers and time for impartation. Don't leave tonight without receiving what's here for you. I'm asking you now to prepare your hearts. So grateful for those that have joined us. We want to start on time. We want to be able to give our speakers more than adequate time to come on and just be a blessing to us. And I'm not trying to use words just to say them. The word bless means make you happier than usual. And I want to see you leave from here equipped, empowered, and happier than usual. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Miss Tiara Sidnor, and she's going to carry us, introduce our speaker, and I want you to can all you get as you get all you can.
Thank you, Bishop Carrington. Greetings, everyone. I am Tiara Sidnor Diggs, and I am the co-founder of Keys of Hope Consultants. We are excited about our partnership with the Life Builders Church with Bishop Carrington. If this is your first time joining us, I would like to say welcome. If you are returning from joining us from our first session, I would like to say thank you for coming back and welcome as well. We understand that life has been both a blessing and challenging during the pandemic season, causing people to feel stress, some grief, experience some loss, and just feelings of overwhelming helplessness and hopelessness that can really impact your mental health, but also the mental health of the congregants and the communities that you serve. Our goal and our hope is that you will learn different tips, tools, and strategies that will not only be beneficial to you, but also be beneficial to the people that you were called to serve. And with that, I'm going to introduce Ms. Lauren Capel, who will introduce our wonderful speaker for the evening.
It's a pleasure to be here today, and I am privileged to present this dynamic speaker for today, Mrs. Bonita Smith. Mrs. Bonita is the owner, and she is a practicing clinician at Insight Behavior Services located in Prince George's County, Maryland. She has spent her career offering therapeutic services to adults experiencing life transitions, anxiety, stress-related concerns, depression, and grief. Her goal is to help clients gain insight into their personal strengths and unique purposes through a combination of supportive therapy and evidence-based practices. Bonita loves her work, and she believes in the restorative processes of therapy. She enjoys reading, playing video games, and spending quality time with her husband, Jamil, and their dog, Blue. So without further ado, I am going to turn this over to Mrs. Bonita Smith to take it away.
Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today. I'm excited to jump right in. I'm ready to do that. Thank you so much to Keys of Hope and Life Builders. I really appreciate the opportunity of being here today. So we're going to talk today about grief, loss, and transition. And again, I appreciate you all coming on tonight. I'm going to try to be as interactive as possible and as engage you all as much as possible, given the fact that this is a pretty heavy topic. You will see me sipping water or tea from time to time because it helps with speaking. So we're going to just go straight on. Okay. So this is a list of different things that we're going to talk about today. Grief during transition. What is grief? Loss, grief, and COVID-19. And then we're going to talk about some coping strategies that we can use to deal with grief, loss, and transitions. So right now, I want to give you all an opportunity to spend about 30 seconds to a minute to think about some questions or comments or even concerns that you might have about this topic and to get a chance to jot them down. So I'm going to start that now and give you all just a couple seconds to think about them. I'm sure some of you already know what they are, but just in case, I want to give you a chance to write them down.
And I just want to chime in real quick that the chat box is open. So please feel free to utilize the chat box that Tiara and myself will be monitoring the chat box throughout the session.
Thanks, Lauren. Okay. So this is not a composite or a full exploration of grief. We are going to touch on some really important concepts regarding grief, transition, and loss, but of course, this isn't everything. So again, if you have some questions, you can type them into the chat or we can discuss them at length towards the end of this presentation. So we're going to start off with understanding what grief during transition is. Right now, a lot of people, and when I say a lot of people, I mean most of the people in the country, are experiencing grief, transition, loss, or some combination of the three. So I wanted to set some sort of foundation around what grief can look like in transition. There are several types of transition. Several types of transitions, and I've listed a couple of the areas that we might experience transition here below. So I listed some under personal, family, career, and of course, societal. Societal is probably the biggest one that we're experiencing right now. Transitions can be both anticipated and unanticipated. Anticipated meaning we have some idea that they're coming. We know how to prepare for them, maybe. And that we're expecting them. And then, of course, unanticipated transitions might be those that maybe are a little more permanent, a little more difficult to process. And typically, we don't really have a lot of time to address them. So some of the transitions that I've listed here are being a caregiver and going into being an empty nester. That is a very common one that I think a lot of people don't typically think about. Having your children move out of the house. I haven't had that experience yet, but I do understand how difficult that can be for some people. Going from being able-bodied to differently abled in your body, moving from singleness to marriage, of course, the death of a loved one. With regard to career, the loss of a job, I think that's one that we're probably used to and expect when regarding transition, retirement, graduation, transitioning from military to civilian life, moving into a new community and having to adapt to that community or that neighborhood standards, their culture, their expectation for you or your family. And then, of course, societal. COVID-19. Okay. COVID-19 has come and we've all had to transition in some way. Obviously, we're adapting now. We're using Zoom to meet. Experiencing cultural shifts. There have been a couple of them that we've witnessed this year. Spiritual and religious conversions is also a really big type of transition. So I want you all to take a moment and try to think about some transitions that you may have experienced this year, and then feel free to share them as you discuss them. Does anyone feel like sharing? If not, I got a couple examples. All right, I'll use one transition. So let's go back to COVID-19. COVID-19, of course, it's been really difficult for most of us. I'm a therapist. I work primarily face-to-face with people. As a therapist working face-to-face, I get to pick up on lots of different things with regard to body language and nonverbal cues, and switching or transitioning to technology and incorporating that in my practice has been, well, at least initially, it was very difficult. And so that's definitely a transition that I've experienced this year that I've had to cope with. It's also required some skill. I've had to gain a skill so that I could learn to use the technology, and then ongoing maintenance of my self-care. It's definitely a big transition.
Bonita, we had Placida. She shared that her husband's loss of work has been a transition.
Yeah, it's definitely a big transition. I'm sorry to hear about that. I think for a lot of people this year, that's been one of the more difficult transitions that I think a lot of us have experienced. Thank you for that, for sharing that. Would anyone else like to share before we move on?
I'll share the transition for me. Hi, my name is Stephanie, and
Hi.
I'm in North Carolina. And the transition for me has been the part with church, the spiritual part. Even though I'm still getting it, I can YouTube, I can go on Facebook. And I am in contact with members from my church and from my previous church in Maryland, but it's still not the same to be able to shake hands, give a hug, just being in the fellowship of the congregation. So that's a big transition for me because I'm an extrovert. I love people. I like being around people. And since it's just my husband and I here in North Carolina, it's just very different. But I'm thankful for technology. So at least I can see, members via Zoom or whichever way we're going to have service, even if it's, conference call line or something. So that's somewhat of a comfort, but still not like being in person. So definitely a transition for me.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Oh, I heard someone else.
Yes, this is Greg, and as I'm looking at the list here, I'm like, wait a minute, I'm multi of these. So, so I'm multi-transitional right now. So I'm looking at it, and there's four of these rascals that I can pin myself to. And, in the mental health field under child welfare, the thing that we try to do is minimize transitions as much as possible because we understand that people do not like change. But I'm looking at this thing and I'm like, no wonder I'm feeling like I'm about to lose my mind because I'm going under multiples of these, and it is a challenge. It is a challenge. And the understanding of how, your spiritual piece, how important that is, because that becomes, and that is, and always should be anyway, your rock, your anchor, and your stronghold.
Absolutely. Yep. And we have one more person in the chat who said working from home and dealing with feelings of isolation. And someone else said, maybe even going from one church that they attended to another church after 9 years. So it seems like across the board, people are acknowledging these hard changes.
Absolutely. Thank you all for that, tremendous feedback. Absolutely. And I like what you said, Lauren, across the board, we're experiencing these transitions. And we're also grieving the loss of several different types of things that we'll get to a little bit later on. But while we're doing that, while we're transitioning in the midst of a global pandemic and ongoing racial trauma, changes in politics, there's just a lot going on this year that is anxiety inducing and can be stress inducing. So it's important to keep an eye out for these things, to be aware of them. I think Greg earlier said, like, wow, there's like 4 or 5 of these that that resonate with me. No wonder I feel like I'm going crazy. I think that's what you said, Greg. I'm not quoting you exactly, but something along that line. And it's like I said, it's important to be aware of these things. It's not always that we're spinning out of control. Sometimes we're overwhelmed with the constant change, with a constant transition. So thank you all for your feedback on that. We're going to move on to the next one, but of course, feel free to continue to discuss transitions in the chat, and we'll pop, I guess, Lauren and we'll pop in on those soon. All right. So this is a really big one that's been, I think, minimally discussed, honestly: identity crises and transitions. So identity is a really complex concept, right? It involves information about how we see ourselves, and then also information with regard to how we want or believe other people see us. During transitions, our sense of identity might be challenged. Things like adjusting to a global pandemic, adjusting to distance learning, moving from being maybe even a breadwinner to having to work from the home. Different things like that can definitely challenge our identity. Questions about our identity also naturally evoke questions about our purpose. So when we're examining our identity, we're not just saying, who am I? But we're also usually saying, what purpose do I have? Those questions naturally evolve from the questions that we have with regard to identity. Unexpected transitions can be particularly difficult for faith leaders or for people who are acclimated to a particular faith. Faith leaders in particular, though, are often called upon to have answers for some of life's most difficult questions. And I said, even during a pandemic. And so I recognize how much more difficult it can be to be a helper, to be part of the healing community when we're in the midst of a pandemic. And as important as it is to recognize that you are a helper and a healer during a pandemic, it's also important to have an idea about some ways that you can cope with these different transitions, with helping people process loss and grief. And we're going to get into that all a little bit later, but I did want to touch on some identity crisis. It's occurring in lots of different communities around the country and maybe even around the world in a response to the global pandemic. So one of the best ways to cope with transition is to examine your locus of control. A locus of control is a psychological concept that refers to how strongly we believe we have control over situations and experiences that impact our lives. So you guys see this like cute little picture of this box here, right? For a moment, if you will indulge me and close your eyes. And I want you to imagine a box or a basket. It could be either one. However, you might be into decorating, so you might look at a basket, but imagine it being empty. I want you to put that box aside for a second and now sit for a few moments and think about all of the different transitions that we've experienced this year. You can think about things like changes in employment, changes in relationships, political changes, emotional, spiritual changes, physical changes, longing, desire for loved ones that you may not be able to physically interact with. Next, I want you to look at that box again. Inside of that box or basket, I want you to put some things that you can control about these situations. Those things might be how you respond to the transition, how you cope with it. And you can be specific. It might be things like I exercise when I'm frustrated that I'm not able to meet so-and-so for lunch. It might be making sure that you're drinking water every day. It could be holding your tongue when you're really frustrated with a cashier at a grocery store. Put those things into that box. I'll give you a couple seconds to do that. Could be a long list, it could be a short one. I don't know, not in you guys' heads, but I want you to put them in the box. All right, so maybe your box is full, maybe it's halfway full, maybe it's a little empty. I want you to open your eyes now. I guess, well, I can't see everybody. Did anyone have a really full box? Okay. Anyone have a halfway full box? All right. Here's my next question for you guys. What did you do with the things that you couldn't control? I've done this exercise a couple times before, and one of the things that always sticks out, regardless of whether a person was able to fill that box or basket up or not, is that the things that they couldn't control, they did nothing with. And my response to that usually is, well, yeah, that makes sense. There are things in our lives that we are simply not in full control of. It makes no sense to really fixate on them, to spend a lot of time thinking about them, ruminating over them, wishing, hoping, wanting, coulda, shoulda, that it does not help us. It's more important that we try to focus on the things that we can control. And so that was kind of the whole point of this exercise. Focusing on the things that we can control helps us get a better, oh, I hear somebody.
Yeah, we just had a couple. Somebody said that their box was halfway full or empty. And we had someone who said they walked away from and they have them over in prayer. I guess they turned them over in prayer.
Mm-hmm. Good. I love that. Yes. Especially with regard to those things that we can't control. Prayer can be an incredible tool with regard to those things, because though we might not feel like we are in control, through prayer, we can access someone who is, correct? And that can feel a lot more calming than anything before. All right. I'm going to move on to our next slide. Any other comments about the box or controlling different things? Okay. All right. So now I want you to take a moment and think back on a transition that you've experienced in your own life. What were some of the steps that you took to prepare for that transition? Think about ways that you got started. And if you had to prepare in the same way again, would you, or would you prepare differently? Specifically with regard to this transition that you experienced. Anyone want to share about how they prepared for a transition?
Greg shared that yes, he would prepare differently, more forethought.
Mm-hmm.
Good. And feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to expound. You definitely can unmute and share.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
A transitional moment or time in my life was relocating from Maryland to North Carolina. And I guess I would probably do things somewhat different, but the steps I took to try to prepare was to kind of mentally prepare myself that I was leaving my job, giving up my salary, leaving my children and friends, my church, but I was real excited because it was like a new chapter in my life. So I was really excited about that. But after I got here, it was more difficult transitioning than I expected it to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
I second that motion. I think that, you know, like, so I'm an empty nester, or was an empty nester, and what happened is, you know, there's some joy in that, like you're reaching a milestone type of thing, and even in a new uh, vocation and a new residence, new location, and all of that, there is that joy, there is that excitement. I couldn't have said it better than how Stephanie shared. But then comes the grinding of it. Then, you know, the actualization of it. Like my house, it's like I can hear the spiders walk. Like that's how quiet it is. I can hear spiders walk. I'm like, stop making all that noise, you know, because the house is empty. It's void of that life. And you kind of say to yourself, oh yeah, I'll be used to it. Yeah, I'll get, you know, but then when it's happens, whew, that's another thing.
Mm-hmm. I like that. I like what you touched on there. So sometimes even, I guess, can we all agree that sometimes even if we prepare for transition, there might be things on the other side of that transition that we just were not prepared for, right? I see those heads shaking, see those heads nodding. Okay. All right. Good, good. So yeah, so this kind of goes into the unanticipated and the anticipated transition. There are times when we anticipate the transition, specifically with regard to something like moving or being an empty nester, and not always with moving, but sometimes with moving. Those are things that we can anticipate. We can say, okay, we need to get A, B, C, and D done so that we can make this transition. But then there are usually things that we're not aware of. There are emotions or reactions that we may not have prepared for that may be on the other side of that anticipated transition. Of course, with the unanticipated transition, those usually just kind of hit us out of nowhere. And the unanticipated transitions do tend to be a little more permanent and probably a little bit more difficult to cope with. So I want you all to keep that in mind going forward when you're looking at transitions, specifically with regard to the anticipated versus the unanticipated transitions. And maybe not being so rigid with yourselves, giving yourselves a bit of grace, the same grace that you probably give one another with regard to preparing for this transition and then acclimating to it. Okay. All right. So we're going to move on to grief. We're going to just have a lot of discussion about what grief actually is and what it looks like. For the next slide, if you all could unmute yourselves so that I can hear your responses, that would be great. Okay. So the next slide is just a true or false. If you believe that it's true, you can give a thumbs up like that. So this is for true. If you think it's false, I want you to clap. Okay, everybody got that? True, thumbs up, false, clap. And I recognize that maybe everyone doesn't feel comfortable with their cameras on or their mics off. That's totally fine. So if you're comfortable with it, please feel free to thumbs up if it's true, clap if it's false. Okay. All right. True or false? Grief only occurs when someone you love has died. Okay, I heard a lot of claps. I saw some too. Okay. Any thumbs up that I missed? I didn't see any thumbs up. Maybe Lauren, did you all see any thumbs up?
No.
No.
No. Okay. So across the board, that sounds like a clap. Guess what, you guys? You're right. It's absolutely false. Grief does not only occur when someone you love has died. It's actually a little more complex than that. Grief can occur in the following situations and more. Grief can occur during transitions. So things like divorce or just general relationship changes. And when I say relationship changes, I'm specifically discussing maybe family, changes in relationships at work, something we don't talk about enough, changes in relationships even in our social groups. So things like church or social groups, a loss of expectations, moving to a new community, and career changes. These are all things that might induce some sort of grief. And there's actually about 40 to 50 different circumstances that we could grieve from. When I saw that number, I said, my goodness, that's a lot, 40 to 50. I mean, I might, maybe I could think of 7, but 40 to 50. But yeah, grief can occur in about 40 to 50 different circumstances. Excuse me. So I wanted to give you all a look at what grief actually is. So grief refers to the type of thinking, feeling, and behaviors related to the loss of something or someone of value to us. That's kind of the caveat about grief. The thing that's most important is that it has to have value to us, whether it be a thing or a person or even a situation. Grief can be experienced with the loss of a relationship, a loved one, an object, or job opportunity, amongst other things. When we typically speak about grief, it's usually within the context of bereavement. A British psychologist by the name of Henry Ellis was quoted saying, "All the art of living lies in a fine mingling of letting go and holding on." And what essentially he's discussing is a comment on the dance that we do around living, grieving, and establishing meaning in our lives. So there's no fixed, okay, I just let go of everything or I hold on to everything. There's really this dance, this delicate dance that occurs as we move through life and as we process grief, loss, and transition. Okay, same thing here. If you believe that if you believe that bereavement and grief are the exact same thing, I want you to clap. If you think that they are not the same thing, please touch your nose. Ready, set, go. I see a lot of nose touches. Yes, that's it. Bereavement and grief are actually different things. Good job, guys. I didn't hear any claps, actually, so that's pretty interesting. Here's what bereavement is. Bereavement is really similar to grief, actually. And the main difference between bereavement and grief is that bereavement primarily refers to the period of mourning that we experience after the death of a loved one. So it's pretty much the same thing as grief. It's just that it refers specifically to the mourning experience right after losing a loved one. Next, we're going to talk about some of the different types of grief. We're going to explore acute, complicated, and integrated grief. So this is acute grief. These are some of the symptoms of it. Overwhelming sadness that can come in waves that last between 20 and 60 minutes. Difficulties with sleep, where either you're sleeping a whole lot, you're not really getting a whole lot of sleep. A loss of appetite, guilt associated with the loss. Different types of guilt and guilt associated with the loss can be very complex. Restlessness, which when I'm speaking about restlessness, I'm more so discussing this desire to be dutiful. And we're going to get to that in a second. Difficulty focusing and moments of intense distress, like I said, that could last for as long as 60 minutes. These are some of the signs of acute grief. Again, this is not a composite list of them, but this is a good number of them. And they're typical parts of the grieving process. Many people who are experiencing acute grief may still experience moments of joy or moments of happiness. So their happiness isn't completely gone. It's just that it doesn't show up as often. Over the course of several months, acute grief begins to gradually resolve itself naturally. And then there tends to be a loss in intensity of the sadness and of the symptoms that are experienced over that course of that several months. So acute grief is usually what we experience as soon as we're experiencing a grief-inducing situation or a loss. Complicated grief is essentially acute grief, but you take it up a couple notches. Complicated grief occurs when a person has difficulty transitioning from acute grief to integrated grief. Remember, I talked about integrated grief just a couple slides ago, and we're going to talk about what that is exactly soon. People who experience complicated grief tend to experience acute grief for years. So those acute grief symptoms that we talked about, the sadness, the sleep difficulties, loss in appetite, those things, a person who's experiencing complicated grief may experience those signs and symptoms for years. They may also feel some feelings of shame or grief around experiencing the complicated grief. Another sign that an individual is experiencing complicated grief is that they don't always feel released to live their lives, their full lives. They might feel that it would be a sense of betrayal to the thing or the person that they lost to keep moving forward with their lives. And so again, complicated grief occurs when an individual hasn't transitioned from acute grief to integrated grief. They might experience it for many years. They might also avoid stimuli or things that are associated with the loss. So for instance, if they lost a loved one, they may not go to that loved one's house for a couple of years. If they lost something of significance to them, they might not try to replace it, something along that lines. And again, they feel betrayal around enjoying their lives and moving forward. So there are a couple risks associated, no, I'm sorry, not risks. There are a couple risk factors that some people, excuse me, I'm sorry, my words all jumbled up. There are a couple of risk factors that people who experience complicated grief maybe have a history of. Those include history of child abuse and neglect, as well as a history of depression and other mental health concerns. And so what they found over the years is that people who may have experienced those things in the past have a more difficult time transitioning from acute grief to integrated grief. And so they stay in complicated grief for a while. Okay, so here's integrated grief. Integrated grief is the type of grief that we experience essentially for the rest of our lives after experiencing an important loss or loss of value. People who move into integrated grief can usually resume their typical activities. They continue to miss their loved one, so they don't stop missing the person or missing the thing that they lost, but they're learning to engage in a new reality of life with that loss, despite that loss. And like I said, it's a lifelong stage. So the pain slowly subsides when a person is entered integrated grief. They're learning to integrate the loss into their new reality, which is their new life. They've learned to make sense for themselves of the loss, typically. And then the symptoms are typically no longer debilitating. Holidays, special events, birthdays, those events can be incredibly triggering, even if a person has reached integrated grief. So it's important to recognize that because a person might start having some of the symptoms or the signs of acute grief, even though it's been years and they've been experiencing integrated grief for a period of time, acute grief can show up during those special events. It's not a sign of failure. It doesn't mean that the individual has not grieved or mourned properly. It means that it's a part of the typical process of grieving the loss of someone or something important. Does that make sense to everybody? Touch your nose if that makes sense. Let's do that. That way I can see. Okay. Any questions about that before we move on to grieving styles? All right.
Bonita, we have a quick comment in the chat box. Someone said developing new norms post-COVID would seem to be a type of integrated grief. Would you concur with that thought?
Developing new norms post-COVID would
seem to be a type of integrated grief.
Absolutely. That's, considering the fact that the person experienced grief in the first place, and most likely they did grieve in the loss of their routine or certain expectations. Absolutely. And so what I think is really interesting, even though I know distance learning for a lot of people has been like a hot mess, but what I find that's really interesting is how well human beings adapt to things that are really kind of meant to break us. You would expect, let's even look back, right? We're in November. We've been at home for what, 8 or 9 months now, right? In the earlier part of the stay-at-home orders, the earlier part of the pandemic, everybody was stressed out, crying, falling apart. It was hard. And it doesn't mean that it's not hard now. It just means that earlier on, things were really, really scary. And what's happened is, especially like over the summer as it got warm, people started kind of going out a little bit more, seeing loved ones. Churches have adapted, families have adapted, grandmas know how to use Zoom. It's just amazing how we all have just learned to adapt to this thing that none of us could have prepared for. And though the circumstances now are probably not the best across the board, we're learning to move forward with our lives. We're learning to still find meaning and engagement in the things that we do and with the people that we're around. That's stellar. It's amazing. It's truly miraculous. Were there any other comments about it, Lauren?
No other comments, but does anyone have any questions or just something that resonates with what Bonita just said? Even just how amazing it is that and our ability just to adapt even under circumstances that have kind of shifted how we would typically maneuver through life. Anyone have a thought?
I guess I would say that we are more resilient than we realized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely.
There's a movie that I love called Heartbreak Ridge with Clint Eastwood. And as a Marine, he says, we adjust, we adapt, we improvise. And that is a theme for these past 8 months plus. And yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I agree. It's no longer a theory that we can just kind of put on the table. People are resilient, or just something that we say. We have proof of it. We really do have the evidence of it in this year. And even in how a lot of us have come together to figure out how to cope with this thing. Yeah. So that's awesome. Very amazing stuff. I'm, amazed by humanity all the time and how we get through things. All right, moving forward with the grieving types. So now we're going to talk about 2 different types of grieving styles. There's instrumental grief and intuitive grief. Well, those are the 2 that we're going to review today, or tonight, because it's late. All right. So instrumental grief. Instrumental grief, it looks like this one over here to the left. Instrumental grief is people who grieve on the instrumental grief side, they tend to grieve inwardly, probably process their grief a little quieter, as opposed to intuitive grievers who usually have waves of powerful emotions that they're not really afraid of expressing. Instrumental grievers tend to be less expressive with their emotions, whereas intuitive grievers have expressions that are congruent or the same as their emotions. Instrumental grievers tend to be more thinking than feeling, more task-oriented, whereas intuitive grievers are more likely to focus on the emotional processes of grieving. Instrumental grievers tend to be less likely to seek emotional support or to be open to it, whereas intuitive grievers are more likely to seek and be open to emotional support. So if you ever, happen to get on a computer, Google this, and look it up, you'll find that in some literature, instrumental grievers are associated with a masculine style of grieving, whereas intuitive grievers are more associated with the feminine style of grieving. These two styles are not fixed. And when I say that, what I mean is that you're either an instrumental griever or an intuitive griever. They can run into each other. The style of grief that a person engages in doesn't have to be on one end of the spectrum or the other. So with that being said, does any of this look familiar to any of you if you've ever experienced grief, or even if you're just thinking about this year and how you may have grieved the transition of living through this pandemic? Let's see. Clap if you think that you've grieved the pandemic more as an instrumental griever. Okay. Yeah, okay. I saw that clap. I didn't hear that one, but I did see it. All right. Now I want you to snap your fingers if you think you're more of an intuitive griever, specifically with respect to COVID-19. I see that. I see those silent snaps. Anybody else? Okay. So I wanted to make the point again that if you do look this up, you'll see in some of the literature that instrumental is associated with more masculine styles and intuitive is associated with more feminine styles. I think that's a lot of malarkey, because you grieve how you grieve, and there's not necessarily any gender that's associated with one or the other. Personally, I noticed that I'm more instrumental, like let's get some stuff done. But then I also noticed that I'm gonna feel those feelings. You know, feeling those emotions are really important. I'm a therapist. I'm all about feelings, so that makes sense, right? Yeah.
Bonita, what would you say culture plays into what this looks like? So one's culture, their beliefs, their foundation, what might that look like? Even within like a faith-based culture, what might that look like? When you kind of compare, when you compare whether it's instrumental versus intuitive.
So I think that, honestly, I think that being an instrumental griever versus an intuitive one is more individualistic. It's more of an individual, I wouldn't say preference, but response to grief than it is really anything else. And I don't think that it's something that we consciously take on. It's something that typically we have to kind of look back and say like, oh, that's more how I grieve, or I did spend a little bit more time just letting the tears flow or writing in a journal. Or I spent a lot of time building a fence or trying to take care of plants or putting funeral arrangements together. I think that it's really more about being reflective with regard to how you grieve and maybe less about how culture could influence it. Did that answer your question?
Yes, I was just putting it out there.
Okay. Yeah. But I'm sure that for some people that their culture or even their faith might have some influence on that. I think sometimes maybe it's expected that, men might be less expressive emotionally and women may be more expressive emotionally. But that doesn't necessarily mean, just because it's expected, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's how it'll play out. So there could be that conflict there. If there's an expectation for an individual to grieve one way, but their grieving style is actually something different. Okay. All right. So now we're going to kind of quickly talk about the stages, different models for grief. Right now we're looking at Kubler-Ross. First of all, let me stop. Snap your fingers if you've heard of the stages of grief from Kubler-Ross. Okay. I see a couple people snap. So this is really common. Kubler-Ross was a psychiatrist. I think she wrote this up in like the 60s, maybe late 60s, early 70s. She's a psychiatrist that worked with people in hospice who were terminally ill. So long story short, she developed these stages of grief that were supposed to support the people who were terminally ill. Somehow, some way, in psychology classes across the country, we've associated these stages of grief with how lay people respond to grief. I thought it was important to bring it up anyway, because it's so common. It's one of the first stops with regard to discussing grief in the community. And so I wanted to go over it really quickly. So according to Kubler-Ross, how we grieve is very linear, meaning we go from denial to anger to bargaining to depression to acceptance. New models of the Kubler-Ross stages of grief are a little more flexible, but the original one was a lot more rigid. So in the denial stage, a person is in denial. They minimize the loss. They might trivialize it. They might be in shock. They're just having a hard time wrapping their mind around that loss. And the anger stage, they're angry. And they're usually looking for someone to blame. That's me, someone to hold responsible for it. Within the bargaining stage, an individual may be trying to negotiate with God, saying, hey, if you let me do X, Y, and Z, or if you allow so-and-so to live, I'll change my life. I'll do this, I'll do that. Within the depression stage, there's usually a loss of hope, frustration, sadness with regard to the loss. And then finally, in acceptance, the individual has decided to not give up, to accept the loss. And then from there, they probably determine some sort of method towards moving forward. J. William Worden is still alive. He's a psychologist in the Northeast, and his stages of grief, his model is a little more contemporary, and it's one that a lot of people are examining right now. So his model is about the task of mourning. It says mourning is the process of adapting to loss through the completion of 4 tasks. So according to this model, an individual has to go through these 4 tasks in order to really accept the loss and be able to move on from it. The first task is around accepting the loss. It's usually, like I said, with Kubler-Ross, it's usually really common early on for individuals to deny it or try to minimize it. And through trying to accept it, the individual can learn to try to fully accept the loss and the reality of the loss. In the second stage, second task, the individual is focused on processing the pain and the grief associated with the loss. So they'll acknowledge painful emotions and try to process them. The ways that they process them, according to this task, are through confronting the emotions, naming them, and making sense of them. So in order to process that pain, in order to process the grief and the emotions, the individual has to confront the emotions, name them, which recognize them, acknowledge them, and then try to make sense of them, try to come to an understanding about what they are. The third task is with regard to adjusting to the loss in a new environment. Excuse me, I'm sorry. There are 3 different adjustments that would need to be made: internal, external, and spiritual. Internally, an individual might ask, who am I now in light of this loss? Externally, they might have to develop new skills or take on new roles in light of the loss. And then spiritually, there may be some worldview changes or modifications that occur because of the loss, where the worldview is either reaffirmed, modified, or replaced altogether. In the 4th task, the individual has to reinvest in their new reality. What that means is that they have to find a way, a meaningful way, to remember and to maintain a healthy balance between their ability to cherish the memory of the loss or the person that they lost and to move forward with their lives. So again, according to J. William Worden, it's important to meet all of these tasks in mourning in order to move forward with their lives. So I have a video that I want us to watch. It's Michelle Meadows, it's a TED Talk. So we should have it. We're going to watch that video, and then we're going to quickly run over some coping strategies, and then we'll wrap up so that I'm making sure I'm respecting everybody's time. In the video, Michelle does discuss some difficult and traumatic experiences with regard to loss and grief. But I thought that it was important for us to look at this video and discuss maybe her journey, because we're faith leaders and leaders in the community. And these are the types of things that we may be confronted with when helping other people. Okay. So.
Napoleon was excited to hear about this because for some reason, he's always wanted a twin. So what did he do? He held the baby real high, the same way Rafiki did Simba in The Lion King. This made my mom and I bust out laughing. It was so funny, which made our 1-year-old Caden laugh as well. Napoleon came and scooped the boys up, took them upstairs, and all my mom and I could do was continue to laugh and shake our heads. On November 4th, 2012, my husband passed away from a seizure that stopped his heart. On November 24th, 2012, my mom passed away from lung cancer. Can you imagine losing two of the most important people in your life only weeks apart? I was only 33. When I lost my husband, I felt so alone and confused. I didn't understand why this was happening, why this was happening now, and yes, why this was happening to me. As a young girl, I knew I would grow up, graduate from college, start my career, find a husband, have some kids, and just live my life, but not lose my husband, and not lose my husband so young. He was also 33. Now, the boys were so small when this happened. Caden was only 2. Princeton was only 10 months old. They didn't know why mommy was crying so much, but they did know that somebody was missing. Every time the door from the garage to the kitchen would open and daddy would never walk through, they knew that something was wrong. Eventually, they stopped looking. This was the moment where I got stuck in thinking about how much of a horrible mother I was going to be trying to raise these boys without their father. And I could not get my emotions in check. After I funeralized my husband, my mother passed away in hospice. While I did know that she was sick for some time, I didn't know the details of her diagnosis because she made my dad promise to not tell me what was truly going on. Yes, I am that kid that worries about everything, but also she knew Napoleon had just passed away. So here I am thinking, how do I live without my mother? I mean, I've known her all my life, right? She was my first love, my best friend, my #1 supporter, the woman that I could share any and everything with, the woman that I could laugh and cry with. And boy, could she make you laugh. You know the laughs where your stomach is hurting and you end up in tears? She was good for that. I just wanted my mommy back. Yes, for my own selfish reasons, because that was my girl. But also, I needed her. I needed her to help me raise my boys, her grandchildren, the grandchildren that she begged me for so long. See, my mom had me when she was 25, so of course, when I turned 25, she asked me, where are my grandchildren? I guess she got tired of waiting, so by the time I got 30, with a little bit more emphasis this time, she asked me again, where are my grandchildren? Well, I knew I still had life to live. I'm still trying to get my career on track, so I'm not even thinking about that. But September 8th, 2010, Caden was born. I saw a different happiness in my mom, and he was her world. On February 1st, 2012, Princeton was born, and he was her joy. Unfortunately, she didn't have enough time with either of them. After I left my mom's funeral, I began to think about how I don't have my mom to help me deal with the emotions of losing my husband. And I don't have my husband to help me deal with the emotions of losing my mom. And I didn't have either to help me with the boys. But I did go to counseling, and in counseling I was told I had to find my new normal. Now, I didn't know what that meant or what that looked like, but on the quest for this new normal, I got stuck in thinking about how horrible my life was going to be. So mind you, stuck, horrible, favorite words back then. But I knew that life was not going to be the same. Everybody's life went on like normal. Mine did too, but it didn't look anything like normal. I never wanted to be seen as needy or broken or weak. And unfortunately, some people saw me just like that. I remember hearing people say, I don't want Michelle to ask me to help her do anything. I don't want to be around Michelle because she's going to cry too much. I mean, my goodness, I just lost my mother and my husband. I'm not exactly sure what people expected me to do, but cry. But then I was reminded of a saying that my mom used to tell me as a small girl, never let them see you sweat. So I hung on to this statement, probably not in the most positive way that it was intended, but I knew that I had to protect myself. I was having some serious trust issues with people back then, and some people were actually trying to take advantage of me. So I decided I'm gonna have to fake my way through life. So that meant making things look like they were okay, hoping they would be okay, but still kind of knowing that it wasn't gonna be okay. And in doing that, people said, Michelle's fine, she doesn't need me. So I didn't get a lot of the support that I truly did need to get through my grief. Then I said, I'm gonna get myself into busy mode. So I'm thinking if I move from one moment to the next, I won't have time to think or feel about anything in regards to my losses. I was teaching full-time here at a college, started teaching some online courses, got more involved in my social organizations, and I joined some new ones. So I made sure to keep myself extremely busy. For the next 4 years, I lived my life stuck just like that. Not truly enjoying the good, wallowing in the bad, and faking through the rest. So on June 30th, 2017, my life got worse. My youngest son, Princeton, while in the care of his paternal grandparents and a family friend, passed away from a drowning incident. He was not being properly watched at the pool. Now, I told these people that my child could not swim, and I would ask them to not take him to the pool. But sometimes grandparents do whatever they want to, right? He was only 5 years old. Can you imagine losing your baby? Can you imagine not being able to be there to help save your baby? I have the fond memories of carrying Princeton for 9 months, how he eased into this world. Like literally, the child was already out and I was still pushing. My doctor had to tell me to relax. And what an amazing kid that he was growing up to be. I just wanted my baby back. I want my baby back. While I knew I still had Caden that I had to raise, and not be only mindful of his physical well-being, but more so now, his emotional and mental well-being. This was hard to do with a 7-year-old. Seeing a child cry over the death of another child is heartbreaking, but that's my experience. I developed anxiety, and I could not be around large crowds because they reminded me of the funerals of my loved ones. I could no longer live in my home because I had the constant memories of Princeton sliding across the kitchen floor, crashing into the fridge, getting up laughing and running off and doing it all over again. And my house was quiet. It was hurtful. I had to move in with my best friend. I felt like a burden. I felt like nobody would ever love me again, and nobody wanted to be around me. So what did I do? I got back into faking my life, and I got back into busy mode. So again, people are saying, Michelle's fine. She doesn't need me. So again, I'm not getting the support that I truly needed. I started saying yes to everything and overcommitting myself. So I was moving on the outside, but I was crashing on the inside. Thankfully, though, there were a few people that saw past this facade, and they said, Michelle, you have got to stop this long-term madness. So when I took the time to think about what this meant, I realized that I had to get unstuck from my grief and make myself and Kaden more of a priority for our wellness. So with the constant pressure of love from my sister Chanel, my friends Kayla, Priscilla, Katia, and Tiffany, and my now fiance Angelo, I was able to realize that I had life, an important life, my life that I had to live, but I had to start to change and do things for the betterment and improvement of that life. So I started saying no to a lot of people, letting go of a lot of my commitments so I can make myself and Kaden a priority again. So we've all heard the saying that when life gives you lemons, make lemonade, right? So I did exactly that. As sour as my lemon experiences were, I realized that I had to allow love and support in my life so I could start on the road to recovery and healing. I see my lemonade as the hurtful experiences of my past, what I still may face in the future, but also the sweetness that life still has to offer. I do a whole lot more traveling now. I love to put stamps on my passport. I'm creating new experiences with my loved ones, and of course, raising Kaden, and he is turning out to be one awesome 9-year-old in spite of his losses. So I empower you, when you go through your own tragedy, don't let life sour you so much that you get stuck in the negative thinking of who you are and what your life is going to be. I encourage you to do 3 things. 1, don't avoid the love and support that is around you, kind of like I did. You will need that to get you to a place where you can love yourself again. 2, do not get bogged down in the things that do not matter in the grander scheme of life. They only serve as distractions to your healing. And 3, remember that your lemonade, yes, will be the painful experiences given to you, but also the greatness of life that you purposefully add to the mix. So when you stir that sweet and sour concoction together, you'll be able to manage through your lemon experiences so much better. So go, grab your friends, grab your family, and go get unstuck and drink your lemonade. Thank you.
Start over. What did you all think about Michelle's story?
A lot of tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
She's an overcomer.
Definitely. One of the reasons that I wanted to show you all Michelle's story is because she, of course, she's an overcomer. She's a person that experienced a lot of loss in a short period of time, a lot of important, significant, hard, difficult to cope with loss in a short period of time. And she took the time to grieve. She definitely mourned it. She definitely grieved those losses. But then at some point she realized that she still had her life and that it was important to prioritize what she had. That kind of goes back to that locus of control thing. She could not control the fact that these people that she loved had gone away. After she had come to a certain point in her grieving process, she was able to acknowledge that she could control what she did with her life, and she started to live it a little more fully. So there were a couple things that she also did. She used some examples of how she was an instrumental griever. Snap your fingers if you kind of remember hearing that, where she kind of got, she was dutiful. She kind of got busy, got involved with everything to help her cope. But then she also mentioned some times where she was more intuitive. You guys pick up on that too, where she was more emotional. And then there were several of Warden's grieving tasks, that she also kind of talked about. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time on Michelle's story, but I did think that it was important for you all to look at, and I'm glad you got a chance to see it. All right, so we're at grief, coping, and loss. So if you all have any questions, just kind of like butt in, because I can't quite see you at this point, okay? All right, so really quickly, let's run through some of these. So this is a really long list of ways to cope with transitions and loss and grief. The first one is to acknowledge your feelings. Name what you lost with regard to the pandemic or identity challenges or grieving at large. Maybe you might write it down and then allow yourself an opportunity to grieve it and feel sad about it. It's important to acknowledge those feelings and emotions. Sweeping them under the rug, trying to avoid them, actually makes them more intense and that much more difficult to overcome. Assess your strengths and positive coping skills. So what's worked for you in the past during tough transitions? Can you use those resources to help you move forward now? Sometimes you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes it's okay to take the wheel that you got and apply it to your new vehicle. So if you have some coping skills, some positive coping skills or strengths that you used in the past, feel free to use them currently. Maintaining connection is important. And so while the CDC recommends that we physically social distance, we don't have to do that. We don't have to forfeit human contact altogether. So that means getting in touch with people, sending emails, texting, video chats, phone calls, making a priority to reach out to people who are positive and part of your support group. Develop an adapted routine. This one is really important. And I think a lot of churches have done this with regard to either moving their services outdoors or transitioning to online service. This can be important and helpful in helping you preserve a sense of control and order in your life. So you might include activities that help you cope, like exercising, worship, hobbies, things along that line. It's also important to maintain a healthy diet and sleep schedule to help you get all of the benefits from your adaptive routine. Put some limits on your information diet. Try to limit how much news you're consuming with regard to all of the different things that have happened this year. Absorbing that content in heavy quantities can help you focus too much on the things that you've lost or that you can't control, and not enough on the things that you can control. Remember your journey. So that means if you've lost your job, you don't have to let the way that it ended define that whole experience. Consider some of the good memories and the big picture. And that's with regard to everything that we may have lost this year. And then learn something new. So apps and websites like Udemy, Coursera, Duolingo, and YouTube offer free and low-cost courses that can help you get your creative juices flowing. Things like learning how to cook a different meal, or picking up on a new hobby like, I don't know, let's say guitar. That's one of the ones I used this year to try to help me out some. Try something new to help break up the monotony that you might be experiencing indoors. Really quickly, these are some ways to cope with grief during a pandemic. Again, acknowledge your losses, find ways to express your grief, consider developing new rituals or adapting to a new routine. If you live with someone, maybe start playing board games or exercising together, or carving out some time in the day to spend some quality time together. People who live alone or are separated by loved ones might consider interacting through phone calls and apps regularly to engage with people. That could be playing games together. That could be cooking the same meal virtually. One person in their house, another person in their house, but you're cooking the same meal. things along that line. You might need to be creative to make sure you're engaging with people more regularly. And of course, if you're worried about future losses, which that's par for the course when we're talking about anxiety and transitions, try to stay in the present and focus on aspects of your life that you have control over right now. I would say if there's nothing else y'all heard me say today, it's definitely going to be to try to focus on the things that you do have control over. They can help you have a sense of control, sense of order, and help reinforce that sense of purpose that you might already have. Okay. Here are a couple of things that we can do to help children cope. Ask questions to determine their emotional state, give them space to be able to grieve, provide age and developmentally appropriate answers, take care of yourself and model positive coping strategies for them, maintain routines with them as much as possible. I know that's hard, but as much as possible. No one's asking for 100%. And then spend time with them reading, coloring, or engaging in imaginative play. Finally, I'm leaving y'all with this quote from J.M. Barrie. He was a novelist. I think he wrote Peter Pan. He said, "God gave us memories so that we might have roses in December." One of the most important concepts that I want you all to hold on to is to remember the loss, but to also try to cherish the beauty in your present. The things that you can find that are beautiful, that are full of joy, try to acknowledge them. You'll need them as you move through these really difficult times. And then finally, I have a couple of national resources for people experiencing significant grief, or even you see I have some child abuse, domestic violence hotline, a couple of hotlines here. And then I have some support services in Maryland, Roberta's House, which is in Baltimore and Prince George's County, Bereaved Parents of the USA, that's in Anne Arundel County. The Life Center is also in Anne Arundel County. And Holy Cross Health Center, they host several groups around bereavement and grief, and they're located in Silver Spring. All right, that concludes my portion of what I wanted to discuss with you all today. Let's see, there we go. Thank you guys for having me.
Well, thank you everyone for, thank you Mrs. Bonita for your time today and for that great presentation. It was a lot of information being provided, so we definitely want to give you a hand clap for the awesome information. So again, these sessions are informative. Right now, we all are experiencing this stuff collectively. We learned a lot of some tools and some strategies about how to manage life transitions. We learned the different types of grieving styles and the multiple transitions. So I'm hoping that everyone on the call has something that they can walk away with, something that they can use to help them during this time and be able to share the information and support their loved ones and people who are relying on them. So thank you everybody again for coming and for giving up your time to just learn the best ways and the best coping strategies during this time. Join us next Monday is specifically geared for leaders. We have another awesome presenter to talk about what it looks like from a leadership capacity and trying to thrive during this time. So join us next week at 6:30. We'll be starting on time, and I will see you all next week. Don't forget to share this series with your friends, family, loved ones, church members, and let them also get this knowledge as well.